about your organization. I'll start with you, Charles.
Hi, everyone. Charles Amuzier, Senior Director of Digital Content and Strategy at Color of Change. He, him pronouns. I'm based in Washington, D.C. Um, and at Color of Change, we work to kind of create a more human and less hostile world for Black people and all people. Um, so just helping people to respond to injustice both locally and in their communities and at a nationwide scale. So really excited to talk with y'all today. I know there are going to be lots of questions and an exciting discussion, so I'll just popcorn it over to Alexis.
Hey everyone, I'm Alexis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm work at Switchboard. I'm a head of customer and growth, based in DC. And Switchboard is your tech vendor for email, texting, but we do a lot of other things too to make it easier to run your programs. We have a great audience builder to help you target. We have great fundraising tools to track your fundraising. So we kind of give you everything you need to hopefully run a good program. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that in the context of the discussion around fundraising techs. So it's nice to meet you all and excited to gab. I'll pass it to Kenneth.
Hey, I'm Kenneth Pennington. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. 10 years ago, I was the digital director for Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign. And born out of that was our media and fundraising firm, Middle Seat. We work for progressive campaigns and causes on a wide variety of things from media and advertising to what we'll talk about today, fundraising over email and text messaging, social media, and so forth. And I'll pass it to Kristen.
Thanks, Kenneth. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Sparago. I use the they and she pronoun series. I'm based in Rockville, Maryland, so DC area, and I am the Chief Digital Officer at Emily's List. Emily's List works to elect Democratic pro-choice women up and down the ballot. Last cycle, we endorsed over 500 candidates and helped elect more than 350 of them. On the digital side, that meant building out high-performing email, SMS ads, and social programs. But it also meant fighting disinformation and supporting down-ballot races that don't get the same visibility as our Fed and Gov folks. And we also launched a sustaining giving program called Friends of the List this year, which I'm happy to talk about in a little bit. So I think I'm passing it back to Deborah.
Amazing. Welcome. Very excited to have all of you. So to kick us off, a lot of folks here are coming from a wide variety of backgrounds. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about generally how do campaigns raise money, how much is actually raised by small dollars, and does email and text fundraising actually work? I'm going to start us off with that. I'll kick it back to you, Kristen.
Thank you. Yeah, so we know that campaigns raise money in kind of three big buckets: grassroots digital, high dollar major gifts and events, digital. And when I'm saying digital, I'm talking about specifically email, SMS ads, and web, so really digital fundraising. Accounts for a pretty big chunk of the change here, especially for federal races. Small dollar donors giving, 5, 10, $25 at a time. Those contributions really add up. And so when we talk about email and SMS, working and how do those campaigns actually work? I think when they're built strategically and ethically, that's the best case scenario. And, strategically thinking about all the different, tactics and tricks of the trade, but thinking about the ethics behind email and SMS fundraising being for our program, like making sure to right size the urgency of our communication, things like that. Um, those best practices can definitely help scale quickly and build a movement and raise real money. But we know that the landscape is really crowded right now, and not every program is built with the same level of care. And that's why trust and brand consistency and an eye for long-term engagement are so important right now, in particular. Um, I think, Alexis, I'm kicking it over to you after this. Oh, sorry, Deborah, I saw you come off mute.
No, that's great. I think Alexis had something. I'd love to hear your thoughts on smaller campaigns and how digital fundraising is going for them.
Yeah, I think just to frame the conversation a little bit about what Kristen said about digital fundraising, I think just so everyone knows, There's obviously a couple different ways people raise money from a technical standpoint. There's texting, which can consist of short code, which is the 5-digit number, long code, which is your 10-digit, either a toll-free or a local number. And then obviously people have been raising money on email for a long time. And I think all of those, I think with a saturated environment, a lot of people are like, is it going to continue to work? And from our perspective, we do see it work. We see people get creative. They're able to raise money. I think a lot of the times we focus on larger programs that have a lot of name rec, but something that we see is that it works for smaller down ballot races really well too, especially texting. And I think that as people continue to get creative, especially in a saturated environment, target specific lists that want to be like hear from them, it is going to continue to be an effective tool for fundraising into 2026. And I think something that is we're gonna continue to see, and I'm interested to kind of see how it plays out as people get their campaigns started down ballot, but also for larger programs, is that with the changes in email and how it's a little bit harder to upstart emails from programs from scratch, how the cadence of getting like all of your digital tools set up changes. I think one thing we've traditionally seen is that email is the go-to fundraising digital tool. And as texting has kind of taken over and shown to be effective, we're seeing texting be like the first thing people set up. It's relatively easy from a compliance perspective, especially if you're working with us. And you're able to kind of get up and running and raising money really fast, which is great, especially if you are thinking about your lists like ethically, but also smartly, kind of what Kristen was saying. And I'm sure other folks on this call can speak to a little bit more to that. But that's been something that's been interesting to see the cadence of how people are setting up their digital tools and starting their programs and how that's changing.
Awesome. And it sort of touching on what you were talking about, Alexis, and to build on it, the regulatory and technology landscapes have changed and have enabled campaigns to send high volumes of text and email to donors and volunteers. I think we saw texting like we'd never seen it before last cycle. So Kenneth, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the changes in regulations and what that means, what we're seeing, and kind of how that's impacting strategy.
Sure. So I would say the theme of the industry is the lack of regulations rather than the actual regulations prohibiting you from doing anything, and that's why you see some of the practices you see here, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side of the aisle. So the most famous regulation in the email marketing space is called the Can-Spam Act. And there are some regulations on not sending to people who don't want to be sent to. But nonprofits and political campaigns and PACs are all exempt from that act. And so what you see in the space is really a lack of regulation. And so it is a little bit of a wild, wild west. And so things that are people perceive to maybe be illegal or prohibited are not really. So, um, for example, you can find a list of emails somewhere on the internet and start sending them unsolicited mail as a political campaign. You can purchase or sell lists of data for that purpose. You can send unsolicited contacts even to people who've unsubscribed from your emails, and it's totally legal. And so there's a real lack of regulation in the space that has kind of led to where we're at today. On the texting side of things, a little over 10 years ago, it was just common understanding of the regulatory framework that the only way you could text people en masse was if they had individually opted into receiving messages from that kind of short code. And some really innovative folks came along and said, we don't really believe that's to be true, and created what we know as peer-to-peer messaging. And then some people took it a little further and said, actually, we don't think that people need to even press buttons to send those messages. And so the kind of trajectory of the industry has been more about discovering the fact that there are very few regulations that prohibit campaigns, PACs, and nonprofits from doing what they want to do to communicate to people. And so most of what you think might be allowed is probably allowed. And that's kind of the theme of the regulatory framework, I would say, in this space.
Awesome. And then I see a couple questions in the Q&A about iOS 26. you've read our mind. We'll get there in a second. And Alexis, you're welcome to talk about it, but also would love to hear you talk a little bit more about shortcode and 10DLC and anything you have to add there from your texting experience.
Yeah, I think kind of adding on to what Kenneth said, I think obviously you can legally text your list with one click. Now, that's what Switchboard does. You can upload your list and send to your supporters. I think the biggest thing is how do you set your program up for success and like how do you get everything set up before you need to launch your campaign so that you don't have to worry about any sort of compliance or regulation things. So like the biggest change from last cycle to this cycle is obviously the requirement to get registered. You guys, I'm sure, have heard a lot about 10DLC, 10-digit long code registration, toll free, and short code, which Kenneth mentioned. So, understanding kind of what's required of those, doing them ahead of time to make sure that you're on your timeline is really important. Kind of knowing what type of registration you want to do, and happy to kind of go into more detail. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I think like making sure you're registered by the day you need to send is now a requirement. So I think that's just something to keep in mind if you are thinking about starting a program. And then I think like in general, understanding best practices to make sure that even though you can text these people, that you don't hit roadblocks down the road in terms of like making sure messages are actually delivering, you have any sort of deliverability issues upstream, making sure to manage your opt-in or your opt-outs in your inbox, making sure you are targeting to people who want to hear from you. And I think we have a section a little bit later on for me to talk a little bit about the features and technological advancements we have to make that easier. But I think in terms of regulation, yes, you can text these people, but make sure you're prepared and make sure you know kind of how to run your program to avoid issues down the road. So that's just my 2 cents in soapbox.
Totally. There are a wide range of things you can do, and the question is, what do you want to do, and how do you set parameters for yourself so you run a program that achieves your goals. And Charles, do you want to talk a little bit about iOS 26 and how we can, what's to come?
Yeah, and just to lightly touch on it, because I think there are others who can definitely add to the conversation as far as sort of the technical parameters of what's allowed and what's not. I think a contribution that I want to make is that it's from coming from the perspective of color of change and of having um, an audience that we kind of prize above basically anything else. We know that we're trusted messengers, and as such, um, we think really diligently about how we interact with our membership, and I kind of hope and expect that a lot of others in the movement kind of feel the same. I think on the iOS 26 side, like the one of the kind of top line changes that's going to be implemented is the sort of filtering that we're already sort of seeing on the email side around known senders. But I think it's really um, crucial to like treat members with respect, like in the same way that like you would want to, or whoever your audience happens to be. You don't want to, not only for the sake of being thoughtful and respectful to your audience, but you also don't want to undercut your work and the work of everyone else in the movement, which happens if you just kind of flood the zone with garbage. Eventually, everyone will just assume that every message that they're getting is worthless and tune out not just your organization, but every other organization that wants to reach out, and it makes everyone's work a little bit harder. So while this isn't, super technical advice, I think it's really, really helpful to just be really diligent and thoughtful about um, all of your outreach, whether it's making sure that your segmentation is right, or being thoughtful about the frequency with which you send messages, or the cadence of, or kind of striking the balance between programmatic and kind of campaign updates and things along those lines, and the fundraising messages that you have to send in order to keep campaigns moving forward. But there is an upper limit on A, how useful and effective they are, and B, how how helpful they are in terms of creating the kind of rapport that you want to have with your audience. So those are just kind of some of the top few things that come to mind as we come to what might be a slight shift in our approach going forward.
Yes, I love it. Authenticity and really transformational communication with folks instead of transactional. Um, so backing up a little bit, before we talk more about content and the content um, of our communication, I'd love to talk a little bit more about how people actually get added to SMS and email lists, and what's the incentive structure for campaigns and other organizations to kind of operate this way. I think there's a question in the Q&A about how do I keep my email from getting sold? And I regret to share there may not be a way, but I will pass it over to Ken to talk about sort of the how these email lists and text lists get built, and go from there.
Yeah, so I'll share some uncomfortable truths that people might not like, but they are the ground reality, which is, I would say, more than 10 years ago, the standard operating practice on the Democratic side of the aisle was that before you sent someone a text message or an email, you had some interaction with them where they gave you their information. They gave you their phone number or they gave you their email address. Typically, that was done via petition. And if people are wondering why petitions were historically such a big part of the movement and things like that, that's why. And about 2017, around the special election for John Ossoff, the explosion and fundraising online, as well as like what happened with Trump and everything, created a scenario in which people were willing to try some things that were legal but not necessarily done before that time. And what you saw was a pretty quick shift of the industry away from what we call opt-in acquisition, which is an end user gives you their email address or gives you their phone number, then you contact them, towards a prospecting model where data vendors will amass large amounts of data, sell it or swap it or trade it, and then people will prospect from that list. So you'll start sending emails to those people, even though they haven't actually opted in to receiving emails from you, or sending text messages to them that way. That proved to be so effective that you saw basically a complete overhaul of the industry, and opt-in acquisition is somewhere in the realm of on the campaign side, somewhat dead. On the nonprofit side, it's still thriving quite a bit because the nonprofits have self-regulated a little bit. But on the campaign side, it's not very strong anymore. And so it's created this new system, and this is why people are getting added to lists without remembering it and stuff like that. So your data is being sold, swapped, traded, bought, obviously. In addition to that, you kind of have these other factors going on too. And so I want to talk a little bit about those. One of the things that the Ossoff race in 2017 taught us was that you can just raise a lot more money by sending people a lot more asks. And he was very successful, even though he was emailing people 10 times a day. And that had never been done before, for the most part, up until that point. Um, when people saw that you could do that, it created this incentive structure to send more content, which is why you've seen not only the list transfers happening over the last 10 years, but also the increase in volume of fundraising messages that people receive. And so anytime you interact with this problem, that exists, by the way, both on the Democratic and Republican side, you want to start to think about those incentive structures that people have. So Citizens United created this era where money is extremely important. More than 80% of congressional races are won by the player in the race that spent the most money. So people need money to get elected. And there's more money being poured into politics than ever before, both in large dollar fundraising and in small dollar fundraising. So you have these extreme incentives to fundraise, right? And you got to think about the fact that every candidate is out for a short-term incentive, not a long-term incentive. candidates are going to think about what do I need to do to get myself elected in 10 months? They're not thinking about what do I need to do to make sure that the Democratic Party's fundraising is strong for 10 years to come. They are operating under short-term incentives, and all the people who work for them are operating under those short-term incentives. There's a real problem in this industry of people wanting to operate as a group or a team and saying, oh, why can't we, lower the volume or do something else with political fundraising? But the reality is that the whole industry is made up of individual players who operate off of short-term incentives, and all of the data is showing that more volume and less opt-in like is working. It's raising more money. And so that's what's created this problem that we're in that people are really passionate about. And I know Charles has some other stuff to add about kind of offline stuff too.
Yeah. I guess I'll kind of pivot into my recovering English major status and kind of share a little bit of a story. Color of Change, when I joined in 2018, the sort of hallmark event was the Black Women's Brunch. We had these brunches all across the country to sort of engage communities, build like durable organizing relationships that we would then, you know, use downstream to be able to communicate with people about issues that were affecting them and our organizations as well. Um, Over time, that built up to be kind of the powerhouse of driving our membership. We still had, acquisition ads running across a lot of different platforms and things like that. Um, but those events were a wonderful kind of community building thing, and people would be able to, when they received an email, like look at the signature block and remember, oh yeah, this is the person that I saw at the brunch that time, and it was great. Um, Obviously, in 2020, we had to kind of pivot as the pandemic affected our ability to meet face to face in large groups with lots of people. Um, and uh, now as times have changed, and we're kind of back out in the world. um we're finding that those relationships are as durable as ever, and a large chunk of why that was the way that we sort of collected the information offline. Whether it was just like having people standing around at events with tablets so that people could sign a petition or fill out their info, fill out contact cards, and of course we would follow up with like in-person organizing. But I think that's extremely challenging, and it's hard to get good data from that. But I think a thing that we won't get from there is people who attended a brunch saying, "Why am I getting this email?" Or "Why am I getting this text?" Because they're like, "Oh yeah, I met Charles and Alicia at the brunch in Orlando," and even though like um, we may not have talked about uh, the direct file tax opportunities in our state at the brunch, I know that I trust them because I've heard from them. We've interacted.
Did Charles freeze for everyone else? Charles, if you can hear me, I sadly think we have lost you.
We have an opportunity to kind of aspire to better and to lean toward better. And yeah, I think that, at least in my experience, helps to build really like durable, lasting, helpful relationships, not just for organizing purposes, but for fundraising.
Love it. Thank you for sharing. If you can hear me, I think you're frozen, but I think we got most of what you are saying. And we'll talk a
Deborah,
little.
if you don't If you don't mind, I'd love to answer the question in the chat too, about or the Q&A, which is I get emails from candidates I've never heard from or never heard of in states I've never been to. How do I keep my email from being sold? Unfortunately, I think the answer there's really no way. And I will shed maybe a little light on it for people. So the way that your email is being transited, transferred, swapped, sold, bought between people and organizations, there are probably 30 to 40 data vendors that might like have a hold of your email address that might sell it to many different buyers. But also the campaigns and organizations that you're on their list will sometimes choose to sell their lists or they'll choose to swap their list with other people. And so there is no easy solution to this idea of can I clear my inbox? There's actually not a good solution to that right now.
Indeed. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about all this ideas around having sustainable donor groups and deeper relationships with people. But before we dive into that, uh, look at reflecting back on last cycle, there was significant reporting about fraudulent text and email schemes, either claiming to raise money from the top of the ticket, or making false claims about multiplier effects. Um, at kind of a level we've never really seen before. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how recipients of fundraising texts and emails can determine if the claims are being valid, if they're actually who they say they are, and also what role players in the democratic ecosystem have in curbing this behavior. I'd love to hear from you, Kristen, about this.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the number of like PACs that cropped up, especially this cycle, raising for kind of like an undetermined purpose, and like you can usually tell. Well, first of all, I think that that was something we saw a lot, and I think this is one of the kind of biggest challenges that we face in digital fundraising, because it can be really unclear to donors, and especially if there's significant like voter um, focused outreach as a part of fundraising efforts, which we know happens a lot on campaigns. Um, the I think there are a lot of these PACs and other larger organizations that aren't always the best actors, and those folks using the scammy tactics that we see, claiming to fundraise for tops of ticket and things like that, can be really difficult. You should be able to look at the ActBlue page and know immediately, or the fundraising page, whatever landing page someone's using. It should be really evident to a potential donor where the money is going. The recipient line on the donation form should, clearly state which campaign or organization is receiving the funds. And if you're reading something that claims to be fundraising for the top of the ticket, but then the money is just going to a PAC or an organization that you haven't heard of, that's something definitely to like investigate or to consider not giving to. Usually you can Google and get like, Open Secrets or like other pages will show you like what PACs are run by whom, and you can do a little bit of digging there. But really, I think if it's not very clear where someone's fundraising is going, then that's a group that you should consider not engaging with and not advising folks to also engage with. Um, because I think, folks on this call and a lot of the folks that we probably work with and talk to as a regular part of this work are savvy enough to maybe go do that and to like look for those recipient indicators on a donation form. But most cold call donors, my first fundraising job was in development, so I think a lot about like what is a cold call. Like if you're purchasing someone's email and emailing them for the first time, that person probably isn't clicking through to cross-reference donation routing and like really pay attention to where that money's going. And so that's why I think the burden can't just be on individual recipients to like sniff out those scams. I think it really has to be the burden has to be on the broader ecosystem. And I think that this kind of comes back to, Kenneth, what you were saying about, campaigns aren't necessarily thinking about like the health of the digital fundraising industry when they're emailing or texting. They're like, I have to pay my staff salary tomorrow and I have to order push cards. So I have to raise a certain amount of money. And that's why, groups like the DNC, ActBlue, even Emily's List, like major vendors and major players in the space have a role to play in setting stronger standards and enforcing them. And not just enforcing them across the ecosystem, but adhering to them in their own fundraising. If someone is routinely misleading donors or rerouting funds in ways that are deceptive, I mean, in my personal opinion, that should be disqualifying. But that's definitely a conversation to have. Because in my mind, like, here's the thing. If we let the loudest and shadiest actors in the space define what digital fundraising looks like, we're setting ourselves up for long-term failure. We need to be building and maintaining clear trust with donors and remembering that they're real people. And I know that there's a lot of talk about, like, people are not ATMs, they're real people, all that, but really putting yourself in the shoes of someone receiving an email or a text from an organization they've never heard from before. I think digital can use that space to be powerful and ethical and sustainable and build movements that raise money. But it really has to come from thinking about the donor experience and really explaining, like, this is what your funds are going to, this is why we're relying on you for this donation, or even like, that's why we're doing this match campaign, and it's a real match campaign, and here's why. Like, even if you can't point directly to finance donors who are participating in the match, being clear with your donors, and I think we try really deliberately at Emily's List to do this. um, we share, like, grassroots donors have opted in to have their donations used as matching funds. That is a part of our match campaign. That's different, and that's something that we actually track internally. That's different than saying, this is a 17 times match in the next 24 hours and we need more donors from this zip code to make our goal. Like, we have these sort of fabricated methods of boosting urgency, and I think we need to make more of a shift as a field to really respecting donor intelligence, but also not expecting them to have to do their own homework, and, like, really give them the information that they need. Really protect the trust and invest in the kind of practices that build relationships over time.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all that. And I think you dug into this a little bit, but a there is a difference between a literal scam and spamming and the kind of content I think we're talking about wanting to be campaigns to be able um, to put out into the world and the challenges that they face to do that. So Kenneth, you just want to kind of quickly touch on the difference between the literal
Yeah.
scam and spamming and what that means for the space.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of different issues here, and often they get conflated into just one big thing, and they're separate issues. So one that's been highlighted here is like fraud and self-dealing, which is a big problem in the industry. So it's very easy for anyone to set up a political action committee and then start sending unsolicited messages to people saying, "I'm supporting the Democrats, give me money." And it's very difficult for donors and the public to know if that money is going anywhere good or if it's just going into the pockets of someone who's self-dealing. That's a huge issue. That's one issue. That's kind of fraud and self-dealing. Then there's this issue of tactics that might be misleading. So when we talk about the urgency, like the false claims about matches or saying you're going to support Kamala Harris, and really the money is going to something else. Like tactics that are misleading, you see those being used both by legitimate organizations that actually do a lot of good work, and you also see it being used by the fraudsters. And so that's kind of a separate issue, which is like the tactics that people are comfortable with and using, whether it's a match or whether it's some other form of fundraising tactic that creates some level of urgency. And I also want to highlight one thing too, um, that's just a challenge that we should think about. One of the like proposals I hear people say is like, oh, if it's not a legitimate organization, like we should make it hard for them to fundraise on ActBlue or something. I've worked in the past for, at one point, Color of Change was a new organization, or I've worked in the past for some newer organizations, like when Sunrise Movement was invented and stuff. And so there needs to both be a way for the party and people to be like responsible with its donor base, and also a way for people who are forming new groups that might be effective to fundraise, and navigating those challenges without hampering the formation of new groups and things like that is important. But yeah, there's all these different issues from spamming, which is sending unsolicited stuff to fraud and self-dealing to different tactics that people might find more or less savory to kind of the potential for like self-regulation. And each of those things is like a different conversation that has a lot of, yeah, interweaving factors.
Awesome. Thanks for all of that clarification. There's a question in the chat about match campaigns and just whoever wants to take it. Can someone speak to where that money comes from and would the money just get donated anyways, even if it's not matched? And what is like the perception that it can feel a little fake? Like what is the match campaign and where does that money usually come from? If there's anyone who wants to take that.
I can share some thoughts on that. When I when I have been on congressional races in the past, we have actually worked with like real live donors to offer match donations. But I think that there is frequently an assumption from like finance staff generally who are in that position that you go to someone who you expect to max out to your campaign, maybe regardless. And so it's money that like you want to use for a specific purpose, but in many cases, I think, yeah, that money is coming from folks who an organization or campaign expects to convert either way. And so that I think adds to the complication of like, how transparent can you be? How honest can you be? Like, at what point do you sacrifice like strategy for honesty? And something that we do at Emily's List to try to avoid that is we hold funds in cash flow unless we're like for that funds that have come into campaigns recruiting match dollars. We actually withhold those until we run a match campaign and then we do match the donations that come in. It's I think our attempt to like make good on that promise and actually have it be having the cash flow and like budget impact that someone giving to a match campaign actually wants. But I know that there are organizations out there, of course, that use that kind of language. And in reality, they just have maybe a disclaimer on an Act Blue page that says, by donating, you are agreeing to your funds being used as match funds. And that's sort of like, I think that people take different amounts of leeway when it comes to how they use that language and use that sort of like legal protection. But it's something we talk about a lot here because just because something is legal doesn't mean that it is meeting donors where they're actually at. And so that's where we have a list that loves to read. We keep testing into long form copy. So like we just explain to them what's happening and just give them the information. That isn't necessarily right for every program, but it's one that I think definitely makes our job a little bit easier and a little more fun because we can be actually honest with our donors about where that money's coming from. But yeah, super curious to hear from others if folks have thoughts.
Yeah, actually kind of building on that, like the urgency is sort of already baked in. Like if you have people who are on your list like and have opted in and care about the things that you care about, like um being transparent to Kristen's point, really like that's all you need to do. Like I think granted um there you could pedal to the floor and try to raise more with I guess shadier approaches, but like assuming that you've built your list and built your audience by finding people who are ideologically aligned and who want to be there and want to participate in what you're putting out, um, the urgency is there. The world is clearly already in need of all of the great work that we're doing, and so maybe that's enough, and that helps kind of build the sustainability of our programs long term.
Yeah, and building on that, I think everyone here wants to make sure we have a sustainable group of donors and activists who can help build the democratic movement and shape it and change it. We've talked a lot about kind of the systems and structures that drive the practices that exist now and the ways that we can challenge them or just that they make sense. The tactics that people use happen. So for change to happen, we'll need to innovate and think about what kinds of changes and innovations and tactics can raise money and reach the goals we're looking to reach, while also building a sustainable community of donors. So I'd love to hear what's a potential innovation you could see that would help campaigns and organizations cultivate this. And I'll kick it over to Alexis first.
I have a couple, so I'll try and be brief. But I think like just to frame this conversation on innovations, I'd love to talk about the four trends that we see that at Switchboard we're kind of using as a blueprint to innovate and provide tools to allow everyone to participate in these trends. So I think the big thing is kind of a trend towards data-centered decision making. And I think just to shout out like Kenneth on this call, like we have seen firms go from texting everyone to then kind of focusing on like how do we text people that want to hear from us? How do we utilize internal data structures to understand who wants to hear from us? And you don't have to be super tech literate to be able to do that. Like we build Switchboard specifically builds things in our tool to allow small campaigns, anyone to be able to do things like that. We have, opt-out models to be able to filter down people who don't want to hear from you, even if they're texting back long messages, so you can opt them out. I think, we have sentiment models, so you can see people who are sending positive and negative messages and like focus on those people. So I think like there are things you can do to run a data-centered program, whether you have a great understanding of the API and SQL Mirror or you don't. The second trend I think is hyper targeting. So like utilize collectives. Like Switchboard has ones. I know a lot of our customers and other people in the space have them. Specifically, ours allows you to see people who've opted out multiple times from other programs, right? And obviously ours is anonymized. So you'll be able to see like, this specific donor has opted out 5 times, so maybe we shouldn't text them. And so like utilizing those things to allow you to target people who really do want to hear from you and then will donate, I think is really important. And the last couple things are we're seeing a trend of customization and personalization. So utilize custom images. Like we give that away for free. You can use it at Switchboard, customize images with people's names on them, customize GIFs, send by their time zone, like speak to people when and how they want to be spoken to and like customize your content and your lists so that you are building a sustainable program. And I think the last thing we haven't really touched on, but I know people who are listening care about a lot is short code. Like invest in short code if you have the money. Obviously, it's a little bit more expensive, but it's a really good way to show people that you're in it for the long haul, that you want to invest in a long-term relationship, that you don't have that short-sighted 10-month campaign perspective on their relationship. It allows you to build a strong opt-in list, send contact cards, so they know who you're talking to. And so at Switchboard, we're investing in all of those, and it allows us to make sure that we are pushing best practices and for you to have sustainable long-term programs. So those are kind of the things we're seeing in the trends and some of the innovations, at least we're working on at Switchboard.
Amazing. Kristen, love to hear from you about an innovation you think folks could pursue this cycle.
Yeah, something that we tried at Emily's List that we've been having a lot of success with is building out our monthly donor program to be a little more exclusive and a little more modernized than what you typically see from, I think, campaigns and large organizations in the space. So what we did um, is essentially package a bunch of our email best practices that we observe in-house, which is that if you're a monthly donor to Emily's List, we already don't email you very often, maybe twice a month. And if you are a recent donor, we also don't re-solicit you for a period of time after you've given. And so we essentially packaged that and built out our monthly donor program where we proactively offered people an opportunity to not receive fundraising emails from Emily's List anymore at all, period, in exchange for them being monthly donors. And we're also we're building up our Substack presence and offering a lot of like subscriber exclusive content to our monthly donors through Substack that features candidates and talks about the power of monthly donations. Because I really believe that monthly donors are like the backbone of the grassroots um, industry in a lot of ways because monthly donations allow organizations and campaigns to know how much money they have coming in down the line. And so we decided to basically just really focus on our monthly donors and do recruitment pushes for them, but also advertise to one-time donors that if they want to hear from us less, but still be supporting our candidates and the work that we do, they can sign up for a monthly donation. Now, that a little bit shows our cards and a little bit like, I think that that probably is not like the favorite thing that I've like, I'm sure people in the industry don't necessarily love this, right? Because we're like basically showing openly that there is like another way to do this. But we've seen a couple of our candidates model this and basically explain like in a just a simple like box footer in their emails, like, this person is a member of Congress. They don't want to have to keep pestering you with fundraising while they're like serving in office. But if you want to support them, we will essentially withhold you from those fundraising emails and you can become a monthly donor and we'll build a separate track for you. It's a lot of work and we do everything in house at Emily's List. So it definitely created a lot of work for the team in terms of like drafting multiple versions of emails and things like that to make sure that we're speaking directly to the audiences that we have on board. But the the returns that we've seen have frankly been incredible. It's been incredibly successful. We had a really successful launch a couple months ago, and our retention rate has just about doubled for monthly donors. And so we're seeing that there's some value in essentially giving folks the option to choose like what their treatment is. And so we're basically right now we're working on expanding that to be inclusive of the whole program and finding more ways that we can just meet people where they actually are, which is a phrase we use a lot, I think, in the industry, but that we don't necessarily define. And for us, that really means like if someone isn't opening our emails but wants to be a part of what we're doing at Emily's List, we have a great option for you. And if you want to read every email from us, that's fine. Like we will continue to send one-time fundraising to our most active subscribers, essentially. But yeah, I'm happy also to like talk more about that if folks have questions on it.
Awesome. Substack on the rise, the new Twitter. I'll pass it over to Kenneth. I'd love to hear an innovation you think folks could try out.
So, okay, I actually interpreted this question a slightly different way, but I think in terms of things that might change in the future, when you think about like how is this industry going to change and how is that going to impact the donor experience, there's a few things I think about. One is, and people are like, oh, why would you want this? But spam boxes are getting better. They're getting more effective, especially with AI. Gmail just came out with an update. They said their spam box is 30% more effective than it used to be now that they've enabled AI in it. What that means is that unwanted mail or whatever, like the mailing providers where you get your email, are going to be better potentially at regulating unwanted things. We've also talked about how iOS might be moving in that direction. So it might be that like the email industry changes the way that this works. And because the email industry can set rules that apply to everyone rather not these individuals with different short-term incentives, that might change the donor experience. We also have, I think, an aging population that engages with email programs specifically and texting programs as well. The average age, if you match these like emails to the voter file of a donor, is like 67. And so we have an aging populace. And younger people, we don't really know how they're going to donate. And there are some people like getting into this, but I could see people shifting tactics away from email or text messaging if the donor base is less responsive as people age out. And so one of the ways I see people doing that is with social media, which is used to be a bigger part of our fundraising, but now I think is making a little bit of a comeback. Like the virality of things like TikTok and Instagram Reels and things like that is bringing social media back into the frame as a fundraising tool. And then last but not least, I think people should consider what AI is going to do to this industry. Um, Without taking an opinion on like, is it good or bad? It's here. And I think a lot of content is going to be generated by AI, and that might change the way that people perceive fundraising emails and text messages and things like that. And so I think that's going to change things in the future as well.
Indeed. And there's a handful of candidates already this cycle who themselves come from an influencer and creator background and are pursuing the kind of fundraising that um, influencers and creators typically pursue online when they're making sales for their shops, but for donors. So it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out. We just have a few minutes left. I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A. We might be able to get to one question or two. I've already taken a couple of them as they fit in. But in our closing minutes, I would just love to go around and hear one thing from each of the panelists that's giving you hope as we head into the 2026 midterms. And I'll pass it to you, Kristen.
The fact that our opponents are on the wrong side of history, frankly, gives me a little bit of hope. I think a lot of people are really seeing that. When abortion bans pass and when rights are stripped away, Democratic women have stepped up to organize and to really engage with voters. We've seen time and again that our base will turn out when the stakes are high and when folks actually try to meet them where they are. That fire really gives me hope. And the talent and creativity that I see from Democratic staffers all over the country every day, especially the next generation of organizers and digital staff, make me really believe that we're not just reacting to the current times, but really building something stronger than what we had before.
Kenneth?
Right on. So I would say specifically just related to these challenges we face today about like the annoyance of receiving unsolicited messages and things like that. One bit of positive news is that the Republicans are also dealing with it, and it's a nationwide issue. And so you know, it's a it gives me a little hope that maybe there's like a legislative answer to this, like things like, hey, like maybe we should come together and say like you shouldn't be able to send emails to people who don't want them, or maybe we should come together and say you shouldn't be able to send emails that imply you're donating to Kamala when really you're not. So I think the like bipartisan or nonpartisan nature of the problem is a hopeful thing. I'll pass it to Alexis.
To kind of piggyback on what Kristen said, I obviously we are the vendor, we're the tech sidekick, we don't run program, but we see badass small campaigns, digital staffers be really, really creative. And that gives me a lot of hope because I think when resources are slim or when we feel like we need to pivot, people get scrappy. And it's just been really exciting to see people like kind of flip the playbook. I'm excited to see kind of how that creates this next generation of digital fundraising.
Yeah, and I think kind of building off of that, community is sort of the answer to meet the moment. I think being able to like all of us in some way kind of function as trusted messengers, and we have the opportunity to communicate authentically with people who care about the things that we care about. And like even though there is all kinds of noise and distraction and other stuff in the ecosystem, the fact that um, if someone can receives a message from Charles at Color of Change, they remember, hey, that's that guy I saw at the thing, and like that means something. And I think whether it's an in-person event or whatever, just being able to hold almost sacred that trusted messenger status and meet people where they are is really, really important. And that's kind of what separates us from Republicans and from all of the other like bad actors in the space that we are investing in building these relationships.
Amazing. We are at time, and I want to respect our panelists' time and all of your time. So please give a big shout out in the chat for our panelists sharing their expertise and knowledge.